Hello, and this is the Interpreter Hub. I'm Mark Rockford. I am happy to be back with my co-host or other host, Mateus. Don't call me French fries, Freitas, right? And
My official
here
name
we
now.
are. Yeah, that official name. No, I'm always going to poke fun at you just because it's humorous, but we definitely won't call you that. As you saw last episode, the Interpreter Hub is here to make a difference in your life as an interpreter. We're here to empower you, build community, give you data, give you professional development, entertain you, have fun, and learn while we're doing it, right? So we've got a lot of stuff we're going to do. Today's episode is going to be a little bit different because we really wanted you to get to know us. So instead of having a guest, I'm going to interview Mateus, and Mateus is going to interview myself. We'll ask a variety of questions. Mateus, if you don't mind, I'll jump in first and interview you, and we'll go through it, and then you can interview me. Because I thought about going one and one, but the back and forth is going to be confusing and kind of hard to follow.
I thought about the same thing. Sure, yeah. So you're going to interview me first, and then I interview you.
You are our stool pigeon. Yes, or not stool pigeon. You're our test case. That's the word I wanted to look for. So, basically, if you didn't know, Mateus is an interpreter. His working languages are Brazilian Portuguese and English. Also speaks some Spanish, right? So the first question...
I'm afraid that the Spanish speakers will not agree with you when you say I speak some Spanish, but I like to say I do speak some Spanish, although they will disagree on that.
Portuñol, right?
Sí.
It's all good. So, let's start with the first question is, how did you come into the interpreting profession? Did you fall into it? Did you study for it? Like, what brought you into interpreting?
Man, I want to be honest with you. It was never my intention to be an interpreter, actually. I wanted to be a rock star, to be honest with you, but I became an interpreter. And it all happened.
You play an instrument?
Yeah, I do, actually. I sing not very well. That's the reason why I'm an interpreter, not a singer. But I used to be a music producer, actually, right? I would do the mix, the master, like the harmony behind everything. I would choose the chords, everything music related. And I still like to do that, but I found that that's something very addictive to me, right? Once I start producing music, I don't want to stop anymore. And here in Brazil, it's very difficult to make money out of music. And I figured that I wanted something different for me. I wanted to create something to help the others. And music sometimes is more about an egoistic side of yourself, right? A selfish side where you start to write your songs, you start to do what you want, and then maybe the others don't like that. Whereas with the interpreting, it's something more selfless. You are here to help the other. And I like that. I felt good being an interpreter. And music originally was all about traveling for me. I wanted to be a musician because musicians have the ability to travel around. And guess what? As a remote interpreter, I can also travel around. And that's something that I really appreciate in this profession. But back to your question,
awesome. How'd you get started?
Crazy, man. I was an English teacher before. I was a brokey English teacher. I was making peanuts in Brazil, like less than $100 a month as an English teacher. And that was not a problem. The problem, that was not a problem. No, not at all. I used to live with my parents back then. So, they were paying for me to be alive. Not a very good thing to do. If you're watching this podcast, you should work hard and retire your parents, right? Don't make your parents pay for your living.
Take care of mom and dad. Yeah, for sure.
Take care of them. But that's it. I was an English teacher back then, and the payment was not the worst part, to be honest with you. The worst part was actually the students, because unfortunately, English in Brazil is something, don't laugh, English in Brazil is something not many people can speak, right? And there is this thing that everybody says around that you should learn English to be successful with your career. So you already imagine that my students, they didn't want to learn English. They were there because their parents wanted them to learn English. So I think you can understand where I come from, right?
So they were unwilling students.
Unwilling students. Of course, there was some students who were awesome. If you were one of my students and you're watching this podcast, Teacher Mateus loves you, okay? You are not the one I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the problematic students, my friend. They would go to class, unwilling to learn. They didn't want to practice. We had conversation classes with a student that was like this. Did you have a great day today? Yes. And that was advanced English too.
Oh my goodness. Wow. I bet you got some really good stories, right? But that's not going to get us into the interpreting field. So you're teaching English and you just got hit on the head with this rock with paper wrapped around it that said, you want to be an interpreter.
I didn't actually decide I wanted to be an interpreter. So there's this guy, Evandro Magalhães. Evander, if you watch this video here, we hope to have you here one day. And I saw
We will.
a
We
TED
will.
Talk, right? Do you know TED Talk? Of course you do, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And Evandro had a TED Talk about interpreting that was, man, fantastic. Because back then, one of my biggest goals, professionally speaking, was to pass the Certificate of Proficiency in English from the University of Cambridge. And Evandro is a guy who has a very high level of proficiency in English. The words he uses, the vocabulary, the sentence structures is always amazing. So I was watching that TED Talk and I was like, man, this guy really can speak some real English here. And then he was talking about how the interpreting field was founded, how everything started to happen many, many years ago. And I figured that I could do that because he's Brazilian and, you know, his career is amazing. And I got so inspired by that I decided I wanted to be an interpreter. So what did I do? I went to LinkedIn. Back then, my LinkedIn was only to find teaching jobs, right? And I typed interpreter. First thing, I found a very famous company. We cannot say their name here, but I think you know which company. This is a very famous company that trains everybody. Most newcomers go through that company. And then I was, okay, let me apply. I was afraid I wouldn't be able to make it, man, because they asked for a high level of proficiency in English, and I had never worked with native speakers before. I was just an English teacher teaching like B1, B2 level students, but I gave it a try, right? And I decided to do it. They invited me for an interview, and what a surprise that was, to be honest with you. I was the last applicant to have a chance to talk, so I had to watch everyone talk about their career and their lives first. And I was the only one who
Wait,
had never
they
been
had
to
a
an English-speaking
group interview?
country before. Yes. Group interview. And like,
Oh,
man, I
that's
think 25
nerve-wracking.
applicants. 25 applicants. It took 2 or 3 hours for me to say my first hello, just so you can have an idea.
That
Yeah,
sounds
everybody was
time-consuming,
awesome. Yes.
nerve-wracking, and just oof.
Yeah, dude. And everybody was talking about how many times they had traveled the world, the places they had been to, how awesome they had the experiences with many English speakers in different places of the world. And I was like, man, I only talk to my students and they're like B1, B2 level at best.
I've watched Netflix.
Yeah, I watched a lot of Netflix. But dude, I had my books beside me, right? A lot of books like Phonology 1, Phonology 2, Idioms in Use, very advanced books. And I started showing my books and say, hey, I'm an English teacher. I'm studying for a very difficult proficiency test. I think I can do it. I haven't been abroad yet because I come from a very humble family. But I trust that my English level is good enough to give it a try. And surprise, I passed the first stage of the interview. The second stage was about interpreting. So you had to interpret like a medical phone call without no training. They just wanted to check and see if you would be a great fit, right? And I did it very fine because the other guy who was there with me, I think he had to interpret the expression to pass out, right? In English, from Portuguese into English. And he said pass away. And that's a very different meaning. Yeah. So thank you for making a mistake there, my friend. You got me the job. That's why I have a career now. But that's how I got into interpreting, right? And then we had a month-long training program. That was extremely difficult because I was still teaching English. So I had to teach my students, come back home, study a lot, go to the training, which was full-time. So I would be in the training full-time. And then at night, I would teach English. And once I was back home, I would have to study the content from the training program. But I was able to pass. So that was my
That's awesome.
experience
Well,
getting into the field.
Since you pointed out that you jumped on the back of somebody else's mistake, you got to share one of yours. Like, what was your most embarrassing mistake when you were in your training? Like, you had to mess up a word, or who knows? What did you do?
Man, it was not on training. It was actually my first OPI call. It is the only call in my career I failed. It was my first call. Man, I was so nervous because, you know, the training was done with Brazilians, right? So it was done in English, but they were Brazilians. The moment I heard somebody on the phone, hello, interpreter, good morning, in that very American accent, I started shaking. I was like, man, do I even know how to speak English? I don't think I can do it. Very
You were, like,
nerve-wracking.
trembling, like real trembling.
Absolutely, absolutely. Like really, really shaking and trembling. And the call started. I couldn't remember the things that were being said, man. Like I had practiced that the entire month long, but I couldn't remember anything anymore. And the provider was pretty rude with me. But now I understand, right? Back then, I was a little shaky with what she said. That made me a little sad because she said something like, you know what, interpreter, that's okay. We had enough. I think it's best if we move on without the interpreter, right? And then she just hung up like, no, nothing else.
In other words, you suck, and I can be
Yeah.
better without you. That's
Yeah,
horrible,
my
right?
first call, dude.
But you didn't
first
give up.
call.
You didn't give
No.
up. right?
Man,
You
that's
kept
the
going.
thing I talk about all the time. Narratives, right? That's a narrative that you choose to tell yourself. And I decided that was because I was nervous and because I had never talked to a native speaker before on the phone. It was not because I lacked skills. If I lacked skills, I wouldn't have passed the training. I wouldn't be there, right? So I took a deep breath, went outside for a while, came back into my room, and then I went for the next call. It was a success. And I never failed a call after that, which is something that I say very proudly. It's difficult to see someone who's never failed 2 calls. I failed 1, but not 2.
Right. Well, that's not to say you didn't make mistakes, right? But you didn't have a total disaster. There was no
I made a lot of
crashing
mistakes.
and
Yeah.
burning.
There wasn't
Yeah.
another provider who would say they're better off without me. That was just the first one. We stopped the call, hung up, and, this interpreter is lame.
You can't beat that. Yeah, I did make some mistakes as well, right? Like when I was learning Spanish is my second language, obviously. English is my first, right? Like in my advanced Spanish class, first time in Mexico, this is where I came to immerse myself in Spanish, right? I was like thinking I was all big shot and speaking, and then like they were like, oh, whatever, like you've got a lot of confidence, and I'm like, sí, porque no estoy embarazado, right? Like I'm not embarrassed, but
that's
embarazado
not
is one of those
nice.
false
Not a
cognates.
nice
I
thing
said I
to
wasn't
say.
pregnant, and they just all laughed at me. And I was like, what? And then this guy from, I think it was Norway, that was also studying there, turned to me and said, embarazado's pregnant. And he was just dying, like tears rolling down his face.
You made everybody
laughing at
happy
me.
that day.
I did. It was awesome. So, hey, if you don't try, you can't make mistakes and you can't succeed.
Exactly.
Right? So that is awesome. Speaking of succeeding, you recently moved on to another level, right? You've been a remote interpreter, which is awesome, right?
Yes.
And you've been traveling, which we'll get into in a bit. But tell us
Yes.
about your most recent assignment. What have you been doing?
I've been doing conference interpreting now. High level, high stakes, much more difficult because like when we're dealing with our LEPs,
Much higher pay?
much higher pay, of course, like 4 or 5 times more. I gotta be honest, guys. I'm not gonna mention the values here. That's confidential, but I can say 4 to 5 times more than regular OPI. But the thing is, usually when we're working with our OPI calls, what happens is that the LEP comes from a humble beginning. They don't use very complex vocabulary. Now, when you're interpreting for someone with a master's degree at an international conference, but they just happen to not speak English and they need a qualified interpreter, my friend, that's next level. I'm
Whole
gonna tell
nother
you that.
level.
Like, yeah,
Whole nother level.
you gotta be
You gotta
prepared
really
because
prepare.
simultaneous, you don't have time to research the vocabulary, and if you change too much what the speaker is saying, you might affect his credibility, right? Because he's using complex vocabulary, he expects to be understood in a complex way in English as well. So really, way
That's
more
exactly
difficult.
right. He still has communicative autonomy. It's still his voice. It's still his message, and you don't have the right to change it, right? You've got to keep it as close to the original meaning and message as possible. And sometimes, as you said, the word choice is got to be spot on. Not sometimes, all the time, right?
All the
it's,
time.
It's different.
It's
because
difficult to get it right all the time. Let's be honest, right? When you're under pressure, because when you're working with OPI, if you're just starting here, don't get me wrong, you might feel nervous while you're taking calls. But me, like I've taken over 7,000 calls right now. I don't feel nervous when I'm handling an OPI phone call. But when you are conference interpreting, high stakes, a room full of people, they're talking about investments in like millions and millions of dollars. People need you to communicate effectively. That's a whole different story, right? And you can't make mistakes. You're being very well paid. What's your excuse not to deliver your best? Yeah, you're gonna
100%.
make mistakes.
I mean,
but,
both are
you know,
important,
yeah.
right? But you don't have the chance to go back and correct yourself with science.
You don't have the
that you do
chance to
with-
correct yourself.
with
And there's something else.
consecutive.
If you're an OPI interpreter, maybe you don't know what relay is. Relay is, for example, the guy was speaking Portuguese. I was interpreting him into English. And then the French, the Nepali interpreter, the Spanish interpreter, they all depended on my English to interpret his message into the other languages. So if I wasn't able to interpret him into English, all the other languages would have struggled a lot to pass the message along.
Wow. I have to jump in here, right? Because
Sure.
if you don't know much about Simul, you've got to understand, you usually interpret Simul one direction, into your native, right? So Mateus would normally be going into Brazilian Portuguese from English, which is to say that the client found your English good enough, like really good. You have a very high level of English for them to hire you and trust you to go into your second language
Yes.
at at a SIMO level, right? So that's rare. Even in IEC, which is the International Conference Interpreter Association, right? It's in French, not in my poor English interpretation of it, right? But that is great. Way to go, Mateus. I gotta say, congratulations on that. How did you get this gig, man? How did you get into it?
Man, I'm going to give a very important tip to everyone watching this video here. If you want to get the best gigs when it comes to interpreting, you got to prove that you're valuable enough. No one's going to trust you just because you say you've got the skills. You got to prove that. And how was I able to prove that to a point where they made me interpret Portuguese into English in a very complex situation? There's this test called Certificate of Proficiency in English. It's offered by the University of Cambridge. It is a very difficult test, very demanding. Most people that pass this test have been English teachers their entire lives, or they have lived in English-speaking countries for a very long time. But if you dedicate, I had to study like for 4 years, studying every day to pass it. Yeah, that's a certificate, man, that once you show that to your employer, they will accept you right away. There's no way to question that. It's Cambridge. The University of Cambridge is saying, hey, look, you've got the C2 level. And I didn't just get a C2. I got literally maximum score, 230 out of 230 in the speaking test. So literally maximum score. And when the employers see that, when the agencies see that, they trust me to interpret Portuguese into English because they see that and they think, okay, this guy got the level
Native
enough
level
to do
proficiency.
that. Yeah. So that's my biggest tip. If you want to improve, my greatest tip for you right now is focus on really refining your English language proficiency. Don't think just because you are an OPI interpreter, you have mastered English. That's not right to think. Even me still mastering English.
I haven't mastered English, and it's
You're
my
a native
first
speaker.
language.
Yeah, dude.
It's tough, man. Languages are tough. I'm not going to say that any language is tougher than the other. That would get us way off sidetracked. But languages are tough. But congratulations. But what I'm understanding from you is that it took 4 years of preparation and hard work to get to the level where you got the achievement, right? Something that actually said, Mateus is good. Right?
Yes.
This isn't just like your CV or like, I'm
No,
the best.
it's Cambridge.
Right? Mateus is
Yeah.
good. It's Cambridge. Like it is. So you have something that backs up your skills, something that is internationally recognized, that sets you apart from the
It does.
average Brazilian, Portuguese, English interpreter, right?
Especially in Brazil,
So-
right, where the level of English language proficiency is very low. When they find that, the gig is mine. Like, here, take your assignment, go and shine. But great powers, they come with great responsibility, right? Had I made a mess during that event, they wouldn't invite me again. And I was able to get a very nice reference letter. That's another important tip for you. Collect reference letters from the employers you've worked with, the agencies, because a reference letter with a name, a stamp on it, an email address where they can send the email and say, hey, Mateus really worked with you, and the people on the other side will reply back. That is really valuable, right, Mark? That's how you prove your value. Because if you just say, hey, I'm the best Portuguese interpreter in the market, no one's going to believe that. Now, if you show references, if you show stuff.
Unless your name is Evandro, right?
Yeah,
So-
Evandro, if you're watching this again, thank you so much for inspiring me to become an interpreter. That was awesome.
So, well, that 4 years of prep is valuable, but for this assignment, I'm sure you did some specific prep, and I'd also like to touch on appearance, right? Like,
Yes.
I am sure you didn't go to the interview, right? I have nothing against tattoos. Most people don't, right? But you probably wore a tie, something, button-up shirt, like look.
Yes, I was very well dressed,
presentable,
yes.
right?
Yes, of
Exactly.
course. You have
So-
to be very well dressed. Invest in your clothes when it comes to working, right? Here is a podcast. I'm working with a simple shirt. But if I were to be at an interview right now with a high paying client, man, I would be really dressed to kill, right? Because that tells a lot.
Look the
Especially
part.
because I got a lot of tattoos, right? People can misinterpret my tattoos if I don't dress myself accordingly.
100%. And what it is not just your tattoos, but like your prep. The fact that you put on a suit and tie, or at least a shirt and tie, and take care of your personal grooming and everything says this assignment is important to me. You are saying it's worth my time investment of whatever this takes to get ready, right? In some cases,
Yes.
it doesn't take much. I don't have much to work with, right? But in others, it does. So that is great. Okay. Well, that is awesome because we've shown that you can progress with English teacher, remote interpreter, right? And this is income levels, because I don't want to say that there's anything wrong with any of these levels. That is not the impression we're trying to give, right? But the more skills you have, the more opportunities and doors you're going to open up, right? And the more financial incentive you're going to make. Because if you can be, I don't know how many English teachers there are in Brazil. Let's say that there's 100,000, just to
A
throw
lot,
out a
yeah.
number, probably way wrong, right? But of those 100,000, how many become interpreters? Let's say half, probably less, right? But let's say there's 50,000. Of those 50,000 remote interpreters, I'm going to guess, just because I know some in the market, right? Some of them stop at just telephonic. Some
Yes.
of them do both
Most
telephonic
of
and
them,
video,
yeah.
right? Which is a little bit more complex. And then some of you will actually go on to do conference interpreting, remote simultaneous interpreting, so that you can provide that service, use that other skill, because simul is very different from consecutive, right? And make more money. So you can progress in this in terms of financial incentive in the industry,
Absolutely.
right? So that is awesome. And you did it in very little time. When did you start as an
I did
interpreter?
it.
What year?
2022. Yeah, early 2022.
2022, and we're in 2025. So in
3 years,
2
yeah,
years
roughly.
and in a little bit. Yeah, I know 2025. Mine is 22, but we're just starting, right? It's 3 years technically by years, but let's say 2 years and a couple months. You've made a progression, right? That's not to say you're not going to do remote OPI and remote VRI. You probably still are, because that's your bread and butter. That's
Yeah.
daily.
And I love
Those
doing it.
Assignments are available. You get to help people, right? That's awesome. But if you can also combine that with these other assignments where you make more money, why wouldn't you, right? And you help people in a different way, because as you said, there's still high stakes. These are still people that need help communicating, that don't have the skills that they need, that you're bringing to the table, so that they can still have their voice, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I've been very criticized for a video that I recorded and posted on LinkedIn, because I said that being a conference interpreter or working with simultaneous interpreting is more advanced than doing over the phone interpreting. But the fact is, if you compare the two scenarios I've presented here, where you are interpreting a simple call where you are filling a form, and a conference interpreting session, high stakes situation where people are talking about millions and millions of dollars, and they depend on your communication to negotiate that, and you're interpreting from Portuguese into English, or from your language into English, we need to come to a conclusion that there is a skill discrepancy here, right? It's not the same thing. So that's the reason why they pay you 4 times more. So what I meant to say is, if you are an over-the-phone interpreter, you can focus on shifting your career towards simultaneous and conference interpreting to make more money if you want. Now, if you want to make $1 a minute working as an over-the-phone interpreter, consecutive interpreting, I don't think that that's very feasible, to be honest with you. You can do your best. I don't think that the market will allow you to make that much money, especially outside the United States. Not going to happen. So if you focus
I
on...
can't give
Yeah.
away LSP's rates, but I don't know of any LSP that charges $1 a minute for Brazilian Portuguese, right? Like,
But the interpreters
it's
think
not
that,
the going
that they
rates.
do that. They think that the LSPs are charging the clients like $3 to $4 a minute. This is what I hear very often.
Used
in
to
the
be
community.
a long time ago. You could find some of those. You might still find a few contracts where you've got like a big law firm or something that very rarely uses, one of the bigger companies that's been around since, I don't know.
Talking about
1972.
hospitals, which is what we service the most. Do you think that a hospital is
Yeah,
paying
hospitals.
$3 a minute?
Maybe for sign language, maybe, right? Just because it's got two things that other languages don't, which is incredibly high demand and very low supply, right? So most languages don't have that combination. Most languages have high demand and high supply, or lower demand and people that are at least not mediocre, medium supply, right? Or higher supply, because this can be a profitable business compared to other things, as we saw with Mohammed, right? Like, you have
Yes.
engineers, you have nurses, you have doctors that can't make as much in their chosen profession as you can interpret. English teachers, right? As another example, right?
Yes.
So, there's a lot we could go into, but let's shift back to Interpreter Hub.
Sure.
Where did this come from, man? Like, where did you get this idea?
Dude, I'm going to be honest
Why
with
do you like
Yeah.
it?
The thing is, I am a very proactive person. It's part of my personality. I always tell people that they should be more proactive. So once I started in the interpreting industry, I started creating WhatsApp groups, and I wanted to link all the interpreters I knew, exchange information, and I wanted to help everyone. That's a part of my personality. I want to help people. And when I started the community that made Interpreter Hub possible, I never had plans to actually start a company and name it. But I started to get known amongst my community. People would say, oh, if you have a question, talk to Mateus about it. He can help. And at some point, I was like, okay, why not start a global group and help everybody that I possibly can? But I never thought that things would happen so fast like they're happening now. Because we have just on our newsletter over 1,200 interpreters, dude, in very little time. 1,200 interpreters. And
we're going to make
what's
an
up?
impact, right?
700 people.
Awesome.
Yeah.
I do need to
people.
clarify, though, because I see a lot of people saying, hey, I want to apply, right? The Interpreter Hub, is it an LSP?
Yeah, don't send me your resume, guys. We're not hiring interpreters now. Man, I get resumes every day, like probably, I don't know, 20 resumes, between 10 and 20 resumes a day, which is crazy.
That is crazy. But the Interpreter Hub is not a company. It is not an LSP, which is a language service provider. It doesn't have clients, right? It is a community. That isn't to say that it's not going to provide, some way of, it's not going to have some money-making way in the future. Of course it will, right?
It will.
Mateus,
Yeah,
and
we
I
have
can't
to
do
survive,
this for free, right? We have to make some money to be able here to put out this content, right? But we are not a language company. We are not providing services to hospitals, lawyers, law firms, police departments, immigration, anything like that, right? So you want a job? Awesome. It's not with the Interpreter Hub, right? We have other things that you can volunteer your time and help out and help us grow as a community so we can help more people. That's great. But if you want to provide services, I'm going to say a job as whether an employee or a contractor, there's lots of language service providers out there. You know who they are. You can find them on LinkedIn, right? We can give you tips if we need to.
Yes, absolutely. We're here to help through different ways, right? We're here to boost your career, teach you how to present yourself to these companies, teach you which are the skills that you have to develop, and more importantly, the mindset you need to develop.
Change your mindset.
Right?
Yeah, 100%.
That's what changed everything for me, right? The mindset, which I learned from you, Mr. Mark Rockford. We need to talk about you right now because we are already like half an hour through this podcast. Time to shift the focus to you, Mr.
Okay, I will turn over the interview mic to you. Let's go for it.
Sure thing. I have a few questions for you here. Please answer them to the best of your abilities. Under no circumstances should you lie now.
I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
All right. Amen. Now we are ready to start. We have here the first question I have to ask that.
I have been in court before. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. One day we will find out the reasons why, hopefully. But first question.
It's a
Mr.
juicy
Rockford.
story. If you like gossip, well, it's actually not gossip because it's true. It's a juicy story. We'll fill you in.
Yeah, that would be a moment for you to tell us that story. But before that, our audience is eager to know. I know most of us already know you, but for the ones who still don't know you, who are you? How did you get into the interpreting field? How did you build everything that's related to your name? The floor is yours.
Okay, well, that's a broad question. I got into the interpreting field by being bilingual. I'm the only person in my immediate family that is bilingual. I studied to be a Spanish teacher, and I decided that I didn't want to be from my area, and I'm not going to say this about all Spanish teachers, but I didn't want to be a Spanish teacher that didn't really speak Spanish. I've had those, right? So I decided to go back to Mexico, where I studied the first time, and spend another year. I ended up spending 3 because I happened to meet my beautiful wife and decided that I wanted to stay longer. We ended up getting married, moving back to Houston. I spent time teaching. I was a teacher for a year in a public school in Houston, which was quite an experience that I could go into in more detail, but that kind of gets off to the side of the question. And then I went into sales because my wife and I was involved, but really it's her, got pregnant, right? And you probably know that teacher salaries, like your English teacher salary, aren't that great in the United States. They're not bad, but they're not that great. And I wanted something better for my family because, as you've heard in the newsletter, we were in debt up to our eyeballs, right? We owed everything. And that's something I love to touch on later because finances are important and finances are not something that we get taught a lot about. So I will definitely talk about that a lot in the future. But I wanted something, and I wanted to do order sales. I went into the sales company where I was making a little bit less than as a teacher for my salary, but the commission structure was wonderful. And I literally went around the city of Houston knocking on doors, trying to sell people T1, which is a cabled phone and internet that was incredibly fast, right? Knocked on a certain company that's based out of Houston, and they were like, hey, do you want to do sales for us? And it was an interpretation company, right? So I went in for an interview, thought that would be interesting. And that interview morphed into, well, actually, we have a recruiting position, and I was hired to be a recruiter for them. I was staffing oil and gas translators for the Russian to English and English to Russian languages in 3 locations: Houston, Sakhalin Island, and Nizhnekamsk, which Sakhalin Island is this remote north of Japan location, incredibly cold, distant, hard to get people to go to. And then the other one is kind of in the middle of nowhere, but there's oil and gas there, right? There's black gold, if you want to call it that. Lots of money in that. So I got a nickname among the Russians. I think it was Dada, like uncle, because I would not leave people alone. LinkedIn really didn't exist, and I was looking anywhere and everywhere. So I was just emailing and contacting and calling and trying to find, Russian skilled translators. So that was how I fell into this industry, right? I've done ad hoc interpreting. I've gone out with interpreters. I've done interpreting for my family. I continue to do interpreting for my family without pay because, as I said, my mother didn't speak English. My brother didn't speak Spanish.
That would be weird.
She spoke great English. Yeah. And my brothers don't speak any Spanish either. And my wife, even though she speaks really, really great English, from time to time I need to interpret there as well. So like most of you, I interpret for my family on a fairly regular basis. My kids have better English and better Spanish than I do in terms of accent, or at least equal to me in English and equal to my wife in Spanish. And so that's how I got into this. And then I just really ramped up. I took that recruiting position and turned it into becoming basically the head of an entire recruiting department, and built that up. Head of the entire training department, built that up. And just really got involved with NCIHC and learned the code of ethics and just did everything I could to learn about my new profession. I spoke at multiple conferences, went to conferences, and just as you did, learned as much as I could about professional development for what interpreters need to do, how they can do it, the best practices, etc. And so I'm not your Tom Brady. You're the Tom Brady, if you know football references, right? You're the skilled quarterback. That's great. I am the coach. Let's to switch to my team. I'm a Chiefs fan. The coach, Andy Reid, right? He's not a football player. Have you seen this guy, man? He is not physically fit. He cannot.
But
right?
he can coach.
But he's a hell of a coach, right? And I've become the same thing, right? I've become a coach in the interpreting field, right? Because of my knowledge, because of my experience, and because I just keep bringing it all back to the basics. So I'm what I like to think of as a coach in the field, right? Even though I don't have the interpreting skills that some of you have, like technically, right? But I can tell you how to practice to get those skills, right? I can tell you how to make the shots. I can tell you the form, all of that stuff to really perfect what you're doing.
Yeah, you can tell what is expected from a great interpreter, right? What the companies
100%.
are looking for.
100%. And I've owned my own company, right? So I left the first company I worked for. I was out of the industry for a while, non-compete, right? When I came back in, I started my own company, successfully sold that company for a small exit, but an exit to a much larger company where I worked for quite some time. Many of you know me from that company, right? I also did a lot of really good work there. I headed their on-site interpretation division for quite some time, and then they asked me to help with quality. So I built their quality program up based upon my education background and pedagogy, right? And so we created something that was scalable, that was understandable, and heck, I mean, what I loved about it is I could teach anybody how to be a quality monitor, even for languages they didn't speak, because you can follow protocol, right? There's a way to do things, right? Which again, I'm not going to give away any proprietary information, but there's a way to do things where you can tell if someone is actually interpreting. Just like you don't have to be the greatest football player in the world to know if it's a good quarterback or a good throw, right?
Sense.
So I'm sure I missed part of your question at some point. So dig in, man.
Well, that's fine. That was a very broad question, and you gave a very great answer. And it leads us to our second question now. Funny that you touched about quality monitoring. We have a lot of interpreters that want to become quality analysts, and they don't know exactly what are the skills that they need to develop, nor how they could apply to those positions. So if you were to hire a quality analyst right now, what do you look for? What are the skills that they need to have? And if I wanted to be a quality analyst right now, what would you recommend me to do?
Yeah, well, if you want to be an analyst in language, you have to speak both languages at a really high level, right? You have to have an open mind. You have to be willing to learn, and you have to understand metrics. Like you have to understand data. What am I looking for? And is it something, for example, we created a scale that was not very subjective. It was more objective, right? So it wasn't like, on a scale of 1 to 10, where would you rank them? That's really hard, right? But if you can narrow it down to 2 choices, or if you can create a scale that is really, black and white, then it's much easier to do, right? So if you want to become a quality analyst, you don't need to create your own scale, but you need to understand that you've got to take you out of it, right? And you got to take your bias out of it, and really go into it with an open mind and learn whatever company's system it is, right? And how they do it, how they do their rating. And then you can hopefully over time make improvements. But what I see too many people get caught up on is you don't say it that way. We know that interpreting is not a word for word choice. Yes, sometimes there is a better word, right? Like if they say, I took up my article about P, right? Like, you're not going to say, they're not going to say P, and you're not going to change the register and say urinate, because that's not what they said.
That's not
right?
what they said.
But the meaning's the same, right? So that little change in registers might be something but it's not something you're going to fly off the handle for, right? Where if they say we're going in for brain surgery and you change it to heart surgery, that's a critical error, right? That is just something that's going to completely change everything. And other things can do that as well. So it's more, style doesn't matter as much, right? You can say it tomato, I say tomato, and if it means the same thing and the register's close enough, we're grand, right? Like you don't need to get caught up on those little things. So if I was applying, first off, I'd look to see if they have the position open, right? If they don't, I would still go after it. Why? Because some companies don't advertise all their positions right away, and they might create a wait list, or they might consider you if you can go in with these skills with an open mind and say, hey, I've done this, I've taken this professional development courses, obviously I've got 2 years or 7,000 calls or whatever the case may be under my belt, right? And I consistently get good quality reviews, and I understand why I do, and it's X, Y, Z, right? I would really love to be considered, Mateus, whenever you open up a position, for a quality monitor for Spanish, right? Which is obviously going to be the main language. So go after it. If you don't ask, you can't get it. And the no's a given. That's a saying that we use in in Spanish, right? And no lo tienes,
Yes.
ya lo tienes, right?
O não já tem in Portuguese, yeah.
Yeah, so go for it, right? Who's going to stop you? Well, you are. It's the narrative you tell yourself. It's the mindset you give
You're
yourself.
limiting yourself, yeah. From the start, you're limiting yourself, then you make things way more harder. All right, so it leads me to my next question that I have for you. You said that you had a company before and you sold the company. You are very experienced. You work for major companies. You've been everywhere when it comes to interpreting. Why don't you have a company now that you have all this experience and that you want to bring about transformation for our interpreters? Why don't you still have an LSP, a company? Mark Interpreters.
No, thank you. Not at this time, right? I won't ever say that the future won't bring something, right? Because I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow.
You've got the experience, you've got the skills.
Yeah, but it's more than that. And I would need to feel that I could really bring something that's going to differentiate the industry, right? Because all the companies out there are doing the same things, right? Some of them have their own proprietary technology. Some of them, are recruiting interpreters in a slightly different way. But at the end of the day, they all depend upon interpreters. They're scrambling for the new tech with AI. Whoever can get there first, which will be a whole nother podcast, will make a huge difference, right? But right now, I have been looking for something where I'm going to make a difference in people's lives that is hopefully quantifiable, measurable, right? And I really believe that the Interpreter Hub is that project, right? Because one of the things I've done in my past companies, not just one, but multiple, is really empower people, right? Because every company, I don't care what industry you're in, is made up of people, right? And your best people that want to get up, help them. And they will succeed. They will do so much better than you could ever hope if you didn't empower them, right? Some people just need a kind word. Some people need to be like a step-by-step process.
Yes.
Some people need a little bit more guidance. Some people just need the freedom to do it. That's all they need, right? So you've got to learn to identify that and help them out. And one of the ways that I think that we're going to be able to do that is in the professional development we provide through, I'm going to work on finances for freelance interpreters, right? Because so many of us don't have that. And I don't care how much money you make, you can spend it all very easily.
Yeah.
Right? 100%. It's just human nature. I make more, I spend more. But if you can instead make your money work for you, that's even better. I come from lower middle class, upper lower class, almost poverty. Like Coke, a can of Coke was a treat for me as a kid, right? Like we almost never got it. Going to McDonald's was a big deal, right? Which probably a lot of you can identify with. So, the fact that I've come from a level where that happened to, like I said, I was up to my eyeballs in debt, my wife and I, when we first came to the United States, to the level I'm at now, which I have a ways to go and I'm not perfect, but I have a very comfortable life, right? We have several companies that make money. We have real estate, we have very, very little unnecessary debt. Like I don't carry credit card debt as an example. So, I'd use credit card points. Can be tough, but like you just gotta make sure you're never ever paying the percentages. Compound interest for you is a great thing. Compound interest against you is a horrible thing.
Yeah,
right.
That's
so
the point. Exactly.
I want to make a difference in people's lives, and the fact that we have so many interpreters out there that are frustrated, that want to do better, that want to grow, that want to see some change, we can help with that, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. We are already doing that,
guys.
Right?
Well, I hope so, but we have a plan. Mateus and I have already got a list of different tools, services, courses, other things that we're going to have for you guys that are going to really make a difference, right? Again, saying in English, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't force it to drink, right? We're going to put all this stuff out there, and we will inspire some of you. Hopefully, it'll be many of you, right? Some of you couldn't give a care. You couldn't give, to not say another word, right? But, hopefully we'll make a difference. I've seen it happen. I've seen some of you, as Mateo said, I thank you for the kind words. I have seen interpreters that we've inspired, and I love to see what they're doing now. They're just kicking butt and taking names. They've really turned their interpreting business into a business, right? And that isn't to say they don't have some clients who pay worse than others. Of course they do. We all
Everybody
do,
does.
Right?
Yeah, that's a market.
Everybody.
This is how it works.
Well, in every industry too, right? I mean, you have lawyers that charge $700 an hour or more in the United States. You have other lawyers that charge $70 an hour, right? Or that work on commission, right? So, or what do you call it when you don't get paid unless you win the case? Whatever that the word is escaping me, but there's just so much opportunity. And
yeah, absolutely. And that's the point where we're going to get some hate as well, right, Mark? Because we're not going to be the ones telling you guys to go on LinkedIn and vent out about how companies are evil and how they're not paying you what you want. Actually, we think the other way around. We think that if you do that, you're actually damaging your image. Can you elaborate a little bit about that, Mark? Why someone should not go on LinkedIn and expose screenshots of rates that the companies offer them? Why is that a problem? Is it because I'm defending and protecting companies?
No. I mentioned this in the other podcast episode, and I'll mention it again. I've been called pro company and I've been called pro interpreter, right? Each side likes to label me, and multiple people on both sides, right? I'm here for people, right? And what I want you to understand is you need to run your business in the smartest possible way to make you more money. And that doesn't mean just charging higher rates. That means having more clients, because if you charge, I'm going to make up numbers. If you charge 50 cents a minute, but you only get 10 minutes an hour, you just made $5, right? Awesome. Good for you.
Very great rate.
If you charged 40 cents a minute and you had 40 minutes, you just made $16 an hour. Huge difference, right? I don't know about you, but I will take a lower rate at a higher volume. I've done it.
Absolutely.
My business will do it, right?
Done it many times.
In order to make more money overall, because I'm looking at that bottom line, right? So when I'm on LinkedIn, if I am calling out some of those lower hourly rates, I am setting myself up in a negative light for not only the company that I'm talking badly about, right, or complaining about, but every other recruiter out there. And so that company might be complaining about $7 an hour or $15 an hour or $2 an hour or whatever it is.
$100 an hour.
Which might be a great rate for some people. It's a bad rate for me. That's fine. But then the company that pays higher is going to see Mark out there complaining about the other one and say, if he's complaining about that, he's going to complain about me at some point too, right? So what I'm telling them is I am a complainer, right? And this is incredibly important for job interviews too, whenever you're trying to get a new client, or if you're going for an employee or an employment, then you still need to speak nicely about your previous companies.
Yeah, absolutely.
My mother taught me from a young age, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all.
Don't say anything.
Right? Which is great advice, right? So it's not that we don't want you to get higher rates. God, that would be awesome.
Yeah.
That would be amazing,
That
right?
would
If
be a
everybody
dream,
could pay
right?
everybody
Yeah.
whatever they wanted, awesome. That's not the way the world works. It's supply and demand. And by poisoning your supply, right, of clients, there's going to be less demand for you, right? And there's going to be that other interpreter out there who has a smile on his face
will
and
accept it. Yeah.
says thank you, but no. Doesn't have to accept it, even though they politely refuses it, right?
That's different.
Everyone
Yeah,
will think
politely refusing,
better
yeah.
better of that other interpreter, right? So think about what's best for you, and what's best for you. Even though it feels good to vent, that is not what's
Yeah,
best for you.
feels good,
You need to
right? To
really,
attack
really
someone.
think about, what do I want, and are the actions I'm undergoing going to get me what I want? So yeah, that was a long-winded to say of don't bite the hand that feeds you, don't poison your own well.
Right, that's the point. That's what I talk a lot in our community with the people whom I talk to, because sometimes they come to me and they say, but if we don't take action, nothing is going to happen. We have to let the companies know that what they're offering is not fair. This is a topic for another episode, what is fair, what is not fair, and how you should approach that.
I
but
love that word, yeah.
We're going to talk about that at some point in the future. But for now, if I could leave you with a piece of advice, is learn to negotiate as well. Don't just accept or decline the first offer. Try to negotiate, but bear in mind that you need to have something to offer in exchange for a higher rate. Don't you, Mark?
Well, definitely. You're going to always have to show your value. So back to your conference, for example, right? You got a letter of reference to show future engagements, and
Yeah.
you, as you said, you dressed up. You probably were very polite, used your soft skills, right? You showed your value, not just your interpreting value, but your professional value throughout the entire thing. And that's going to keep getting you repeat clients, right? They're going to recommend you. They're going to use you again. Right? Everything's going to work well, right? So with just remote interpretation, how do you show your value? Go to professional development, right? Show your experience. It's great that you've got 10 years in the industry, right? But if in those 10 years you haven't gotten any training, you haven't gone to any courses, you haven't watched any webinars, what have you done to change your value from 10 years ago? Oh, well, Mark, I've got 10 years of experience.
I mean, I
I've
hate
got
that
10 years of
saying, dude.
experience
Yeah.
cooking.
Yeah.
You would not want to eat my cooking, right? Just because I've been doing it for 10 years does not mean
you're
I'm good
great.
at it.
Yeah. It's what you do with the
100%.
time that matters, not the time itself, right?
100%. 100%. So yeah, I definitely want to give you that advice. Add value, keep adding value, don't stop adding value, and communicate that value. Because if you don't show it, if you don't demonstrate it, you won't get it back, right?
All right, Mark, we are already 1 hour through our podcast now, so it leads me to my last question for today, which is a tease for another episode. Pay attention. You're going to be hated or loved, depending on how you answer this question. I don't want to ruin your image or your career. You know, I'm your friend, but I got to ask it to you. You're more experienced than me. Will AI replace us? Yes or no?
We're definitely have to get into this, because the short answer is it's only a matter of time.
I agree. But we're going to talk about that in a future episode. That's a whole new topic. We need to explore it profoundly to give you our opinion. But we share the same opinion here that yes, AI at some point will replace us.
Yeah, it's only a matter of time. But as you said, we'll get into that later and get into the specifics, because some of you say never. Some of you say in 2 years. We'll talk
Some of
about
you say
that.
20
we'll try to
years,
get
we
on
don't know.
some people
Yeah.
that are a little bit different from Mateos and I, right? And even us, we have our disagreements. So we really appreciate your time. What would make us incredibly happy is if you would share this podcast with anyone you think would be of interest. We do apologize that it's been 60 minutes, but I hope you enjoyed them, right? We will try to keep our future podcasts short, sweet, entertaining, right? And hopefully we gave you something to maybe chuckle or smile at. We'll see. But
Hopefully.
Share it. Subscribe to our newsletter. You can find us at interpreter-hub, interpreterhub.com. And we will see you on a weekly basis.
Yeah, that's it. Guys, I'm going to leave our email here if you want to contact Interpreter Hub. Please feel free to send us questions, anything you want. If you have arguments pro or against AI, send that. We would love to discuss them in a future episode. We see you around. Thank you so much for being here with me and Mark today. It was a pleasure. See you guys in the next episode.
Signing out.